Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a wooden sign with your logo on it without using a pesky CNC. Alright, so to start this build I have some 4/4 red oak milled up and I'm going to be gluing those pieces into a panel. So you can see here the red oak boards that I selected are honestly not the prettiest. You can see they have some splotches and some grayness in them. And I don't think red oak is really that pretty of a wood to begin with. Now, if you walk into a early 2000s house and look at their kitchen cabinets, there's a lot of people that may disagree with me. So for this project, as you probably already could tell, I'm planning on staining or dyeing all the wood black. So I'm only really looking for that grain pattern, which is actually pretty nice in red oak. Now, if you are planning to build a sign like this or get that blackened stain look, ash and white oak are easily substitutable for this red oak here. So I decided to go a little fancy, maybe even a little crazy, and cut all the corners off just to give it an octagonal look. And after looking at it for about 10 to 12 seconds, I decided I didn't want to go quite too crazy, so I decided to shave about an inch less off. So it did actually take me more than 10 to 12 seconds to figure out how I wanted to cut these angles out. I ended up going with my miter saw to make sure I could get those perfectly accurate cuts. And I'll admit I was a little bit worried about the safety of this, but if you go slow, it was actually extremely safe and easy to do. And I realized to get the other opposite corners, I would have to flip it over. So I did that and retraced all my lines. Once we have all of our angles cut out, I'm just going to hit it with a light sanding to get rid of those pencil marks and to just make it a little more smooth. So my next step is going to be dyeing this board black. And you can see on a workbench that I recently completed, I used this black stain on this red oak and it really didn't come out as dark as I would have liked it to. However, I did have this black pigment laying around that I used to dye epoxy, so I decided if I could maybe water it down a little bit, it would work as a good dye. So I put a little bit in some water and mix it around, and yeah, well... Yeah, so that didn't really work. It didn't really mix together because I guess the pigment is not water soluble. So I decided to just try it right on some red oak scrap piece. And I was like, wow, that looks pretty good. That's kind of the look that I'm going for. Why don't I just do it on my whole board? Yeah, so another bad idea. But I was already committed, so I had to keep going. This stuff was just really thick and it was hard to spread out. And it really didn't dry the best either. I did a little bit more research after I finished this piece, and I realized you're supposed to stain it with that black stain first, and then come back with a layer of trans tint dye, and that will give you that blackened oak look that I was looking for in the beginning. But we still got it looking nice, and now I know in the future not to use this pigment ever again. Next, I'm going to mill up a little bit of maple for my borders. I'm also going to use maple for the letters so it'll match the borders and give that nice contrasting color. Sometimes maple does give me a hard time when running it through my planer. You can see here it gives these really long shreds of sawdust and it's just not good for the dust system. It really easily clogs it up. So I often find myself having to clean that out. I headed on over to the table saw then to cut this maple board into a bunch of 1.5-inch strips that will act as my trim. Instead of gluing these trim pieces right onto the panel, I decided I wanted a little rabbit groove that would allow the trim to sit nicely on the panel. So I went back over to my table saw to try to cut out this rabbit with 2 passes, and it actually worked pretty well. You can see now once I line it up to the panel, it fits a lot better. Then I'm just going to add a little chamfer around all the pieces because come on, who doesn't love a good chamfer? Once I have all my chamfers out, I will be heading over to the miter saw. And since I have 8 angles instead of 4 like a typical 45-degree miter, I will be setting the blade to 22.5 since that is half of 45. So when I'm cutting out miters, especially for a shape like this, I like to play my favorite game of guess and check. It's actually a really fun game. It really consists of walking over to the miter saw, cutting a little sliver off, then walking back over to your piece and realizing that you barely took any off and you need to do that 8 more times. Once I have my miters nice and tight, I'm going to slap a little bit of glue on there and use my brad nailer to tack all my pieces in place. Now, I don't usually use brad nails for nicer furniture that I make unless I'm painting over top of it, because I found that when you try to fill those little pinholes with wood glue or wood putty, it just doesn't match the wood as nice as it should. But in this project, you're never ever going to see those nails, especially when you're standing back and it's hanging up on the wall. So I just went for the brad nails. Once I had all the trim pieces attached, I could finally start working on all the letters for this sign. I grabbed this piece of curly maple that I had laying around that was thick enough that I could resaw into 2 separate pieces, and this would actually give me just enough for all the letters that I needed. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm not going to be using a CNC to cut out these letters. And it's not because I don't want to use one, it's just because I don't have one. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people out there that also don't have one, as CNCs can run up a very high price tag. While CNC machines are extremely convenient and an awesome tool to have in the shop, I honestly just don't have any plans of getting one anytime soon. I honestly find that they take away from the handcrafted aspect of woodworking. But I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to disagree with me just because of the fact that they still have to design everything on the CNC, and there is more to it than just pressing a button. But I'm actually really curious to know what everyone else thinks as well. Anyways, enough talk about the CNC machine. I'm currently hand cutting each and every letter out on my bandsaw, trying to get as close to the lines as possible without going over them. There were some letters like the I's and T's that were really easy to cut out, and then there were some like this pesky G that gave me some issues. A scroll saw would definitely come in handy for this project, as it would allow you to get in those tight spaces much easier and get lots of cleaner cuts. For all my letters with the holes in them, like the O's and R's and D's, I'm just taking a Forstner bit and drilling those areas out. Then I can get my little tiny spindle sander and get all those areas cleaned out in the centers. I'll also then switch over to the belt sanding attachment on this oscillating sander to clean up the rest of the sides of all of the letters. There were definitely a lot of spots on the letters that had some tight spaces that I couldn't get into the sander, so I had to get a little creative. I got my Dremel out here, and this actually did a really good job of cleaning up most of those tight spaces. Once I had all the letters cleaned up, I could peel all the paper off and do a little bit of sanding. Now, I didn't go too crazy with the sanding, as these would just be glued onto the sign and you're not really going to be feeling them that often. But once I get them sanded decently, I can go ahead and get all my letters laid out how I want them. Wait a second, that's not right. With all these different letters at my disposal, of course I had to spell out something dumb. Once we get them looking actually how I want them to be, I'm using these little sticks here to make sure I have everything centered and all lined up. Once I have all my letters laid out exactly how I want them, I'm going to be gluing them down. Now, I figured it would be a little difficult to get all these letters clamped down, so I'm using a dab of CA glue mixed with some wood glue. That way it'll have good clamping pressure and will have a long-lasting bond. So apparently the police didn't like that idea either, because they were coming to shut it down. I'm only kidding. Actually, every year there's a Make-A-Wish parade that goes by my house in a bunch of dump trucks and fire trucks, and it's honestly a pretty cool event. But they decided to go by my house right when I was recording this, so it was a little loud, but that's alright. It was for a good cause for sure. Once I had all my letters glued on, I let them sit for a bit just to let a little bit of that wood glue to dry, and then I came back with some water-based polyurethane as a finish. Now, this is where I ran into more problems with that black dye, because the urethane and the dye was not agreeing with each other. Now, I let that dye dry for probably around a week, and you can see how it is staining that maple there. So my idea was to finish all of the black stained area first, and then I could clean that brush up to make sure there's no stain in it, and come back and finish all the maple parts. Once I ended up getting 2 good coats of polyurethane on, I had this scrap piece of particle board that would be the perfect size to make a French cleat out of. Now here I'm just lining it up to make sure it fits on the wall right, because I've put a French cleat on backwards before and it's definitely kind of annoying to have to take it all apart and redo it. But I'm just using a little bit of glue and some brad nails, and that will be plenty to hold this cleat onto the wall. As I set that aside to dry, I'm taking the other side of the cleat to my wall where I want to hang it, and the most important thing is to make sure that's level, because no one wants a wonky looking sign. It's also super important to make sure you screw into your studs so that cleat stays firmly on the wall and can hold the sign up without a problem, because I'm going to be honest, the sign's not the lightest, so you don't want it to go anywhere or fall. And once you get that sign hung up, that's pretty much it. I'm definitely pretty happy with how this one looks, and I appreciate you all for watching the video. I will see you in the next one, and don't forget to subscribe.